Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to such an obscure and strange masterclass. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a film curator and critic. Teach film studies in Canada. I'm the executive director of the Canadian Film Institute, which is in Canada's capital, Ottawa, and we present film programming, international and Canadian, all year round. And I'm been to many film festivals, and I'm honored to be here in Ireland, and it's my first time. So thanks to the festival for inviting me, and to you for showing up on this beautiful day to listen to me talk about a very cold, faraway place, Canada. So, should I?
Yeah, you can start.
Okay.
And, just regarding the Canadian Film Institute, it's only for bringing the Canadian cinema to abroad, or it's also financing?
No, it doesn't finance production. It's unlike the British Film Institute or the American. We are strictly a cinematheque, an archive kind of role. So an educational institution.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. In a strange sort of way to begin to understand Canadian cinema, you have to go to Mexico in the 19th century. A very famous Mexican dictator who had the very fabled expression. He said, his name was Porfirio Diaz, and he has, for Mexicans, this is a very famous chant. He said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." And that, in a sense, is the Canadian cinema's predicament, and has been since cinema began. In that we are so close to the United States that we are far from the screen, our own screens. Cinema arrived in Canada in 1896, as it did in much of the world. The first films screened in Montreal and in Ottawa were films from France and from the United States. So, in other words, Canadians began watching movies that were images made elsewhere. So this whole theme of seeing images that are not your own is really the history. If you wanted a single phrase in the history of Canadian cinema, it would be watching other people. Today, for example, and since the entire 20th century, since cinema was industrialized through the silent era into the sound era, our screens have been owned by American studios, and still are. So 97% of screen time in Canada is American. So that leaves 3% for Canadian film, and that is a very difficult 3% to break into. So we have a very famous phrase in Canada in terms of film studies that the Canadian cinema is the invisible cinema. That is, it exists, but you can't see it. So the practice of going to the movies in Canada is, particularly in English-speaking Canada, I'll talk about French Canada in a little while, it's always to see Hollywood movies. And again, it still is, and all of the young people growing up in Canada now, probably like here, all we see is American images. So we're used to this. This is a cultural practice that has been going on since cinema began. Things have changed, of course, but at the beginning of, let's say, the first 60 years of the 20th century, English Canada produced a handful of feature films, very, very few, and those that were produced by independent, often very low-budget productions that never were distributed because the screens were being filled with American major releases. So this has been the history of Canadian film production. It's a very simplified version I'm giving you, but effectively it's true. And one of the reasons is our government began to be involved in cinema in the 1920s and 30s, but only as a producer of documentaries, information films, newsreels. And these were shown while the cinema itself was being industrialized in Hollywood and the screens were bought up in Canada. We would be the short to the Hollywood feature. So Canadians would see themselves cinematically only in non-fiction, newsreel style productions. And you know, this is not surprising given that Canada's population in those early years is not very big. There wasn't a lot of money around to get productions made. And finally, I think most importantly, you have to remember about Canadian cinema, even today, that there's never been a studio system in Canada. There are no film studios in Canada, nor have there ever been. Anything that was produced as a movie, we understand that as a fiction, feature-length fiction film, were always produced by independents. So it is an interesting and strange, actually, when you think about national cinema histories. It's often an industrial history too, that Spain or France or Germany or the United States certainly or England, their film industries evolved as industries because their populations were consuming their own images. In Canada, we didn't have this phenomenon, we had Hollywood. And so we had a marginal presence in our own cinemas. And we still do, as I said earlier, it's 97% still today is American. So again, it's so close to the United States, this theme of Porfirio Diaz. I think that's really a really important thing about our experience of the cinema as Canadians. Canada's film industry in English-speaking Canada has been, since the 1960s, Canadian filmmakers wanted to be playing in the big leagues, as it were, to participate in feature film storytelling and get those films to screens. So as I said, they would make films, but they would never be able to get them shown unless they themselves rented the theaters, because again, the theaters are all already owned and programmed with Hollywood product. So this has been the constant struggle for the Canadian cinema, is to have itself seen. Most Canadians have not seen a Canadian film. And it is just something that in the English part of the country, it's never been a cultural practice to go to the movies to see yourself. So we've coming now to that mirror experience, or whatever one would call it, to see yourself and hear yourself on the screen, and you're not George Clooney. I mean, I look like George Clooney, but you know, if you're not George Clooney, or you're not Julianne Moore, or you're not an American star, who are these actors? We don't know who they are. And the films are low budget compared to Hollywood. So it's a very peculiar experience we have of our own cinematic mirror. And that I just wanted to emphasize as historically determined. And this is also largely the responsibility, not totally, but our governments have never intervened in the marketplace of cinema to impose quotas. So there's never been a quota system in Canada in the cinema. We do that in radio and broadcasting and television, but in the cinema it was always Hollywood's interests were left alone by the Canadian government. So I think I mentioned earlier the role of the Canadian government is very important in our film history. One, because it began to get involved in the 20s and 30s with making documentaries to educate people, to train them in nation building, but never to tamper with the industry of commercial movies, nor to make films that were entertaining. These were all about education, making people better citizens. So we have a very interesting documentary heritage as a film nation. And again, all of this has changed into the century we're all inhabiting now, the 21st. But I just want to give you a sense of this awkward, sporadic evolution of the Canadian cinema that in the last 30 years has started to yield some extraordinary artists and people who have international recognition, but still struggle at home to have their films seen. Some of the things that Canadian filmmakers did to try to get seen. I'll give you another example of our government's complicity with Hollywood. Between 1948 and 1953, there was a government program called the Canadian Cooperation Project. And what was that? Well, that was the Hollywood studios lobbied our government and tried to prevent them from funding film production in Canada, because there's lots of agitation to have funding for filmmaking in Canada. So to prevent that, and to prevent a quota system being put in place, Hollywood studios went to Ottawa, where I live, to meet with the government. They said, well, we'll distribute some of your short animations with our feature films in the United States, and we'll insert references to Canada in the scripts. So if you look at films made in Hollywood from 1948 to 53, you'll see and hear a number of really absurd references to Canada coming out of the mouths of actors like Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne, and these absurd kinds of, oh, that's a bird from Canada. And there was a person sent down to live in Hollywood who was there to advise the studios on what kinds of references to make. So you can imagine this guy's lifestyle, putting Canadian references into Hollywood movies as a civil servant living in Los Angeles. At any rate, so there was this constant negotiation with the border with Canada and the United States. You all know, as Armenians, you live beside a very big and powerful neighbor. And we've been dealing with our big and powerful neighbor, since we were founded as a country. So in terms of the cinema, it's been a very dominant relationship, but as I say, we are not guiltless. We didn't take a stand to insist that our films be screened. That's now, in this world of internet platforms, it's a whole different delivery system now. But in the days of the cinema, Canada was really absent on its own screens. So what we did get good at, however, was making short films. Short animations, for example, and documentaries, and experimental film. So if you're working away in the margins, you can do things in maybe a more experimental or radical way than if you're worried about a commercial film project that you're making. And this does affect our feature films as well. As we move forward into the 70s, the Canadian sporadic productions that are made, the producers are trying to get some kind of government action to get a film industry started in Canada. This is like 1975, so it's really extraordinary to think about when cinema arrived in the 19th century. We were in 1975 and Canada still trying to have its film screened. So the government instituted a tax shelter program to get private investors to invest in film production in Canada. That produced a lot of film, but the films that were made were all imitation Hollywood movies, often starring like B-level American actors who were brought up to Toronto or Vancouver to make these really atrocious films. And over 150 films were made in a 6-year period, but over half of them were never released. A lot of them were just genre films. A couple of important films came out of that era. So when that tax shelter system ended, the federal government, which has been involved in movies since the beginning of cinema in Canada, established a fund with this organization called Telefilm Canada, which is the state funder of film production and television production in Canada. So producers will apply to Telefilm, and it's taxpayer money that is allotted to various producers. That's still a system we have now, because everybody's an independent producer. As I mentioned, there is no studio system you can work for in Canada. So Telefilm Canada decided, well, this imitation model, making sort of pseudo-American films, that's not going to work. It's a disaster. So the new philosophy became, well, just be yourself. Let's be Canadians. Let's make films about Canada that are not disguising Toronto as Chicago or Toronto as Cleveland. I mean, in that era, they were taking license plates off of Canadian cars and putting American plates on, removing flags from the frame of the American flags on Canadian ones. So this absurd kind of colonial position that we have cinematically was manifest in there. But after 1984, and I think that's the real interesting time, since 1984, Canadian cinema has had a renaissance, particularly in English Canada, and the most notable is Atamegoya, who arrives in 1984, with films that are about Canada, unabashedly not trying to be anything else, but telling Canadian stories. And what also happened in 1984 was the arrival of what we called then pay television, which is not network, but you subscribe to this TV channel. Those pay TV networks had to have a Canadian content quota because the broadcast sector in Canada is regulated. So there was a quota system, and there was a delivery platform for movies. That wasn't the big screen in the cinema halls, still isn't, but it was a small screen delivery. And what it meant was that producers and directors could now get an audience, and they could also get access to money from the broadcasters who needed to have Canadian stuff to show. So, the years go by and more people get to work more regularly because they now have an option. And now in the internet age, Canadian filmmakers are delivering their films in all kinds of platforms. So it's a long way from where I started with, the absence of the Canadian image on Canadian screens. And we're still there in terms of the cinema hall, so 3%. So if you were to visit Canada and you look through the newspaper or you looked online for what film you're going to go see, you wouldn't find one. But you would find, all of the Hollywood stuff that you probably get here too. I don't know if Armenia is dominated in the way that we are. So it's an interesting history that we have in terms of English-speaking Canada. that we've been marginalized, but again, that enabled our filmmakers to be more experimental and creative because they're working, generally, they're all writer, director, auteur filmmakers who are raising their own budgets, making films with their friends, but being able, in a way, not to answer to a commercial studio. So you can make a film that's a little more experimental, a little more edgy, perhaps. And our filmmakers have, over the last 30 years, won a lot of prizes at international festivals and have garnered a lot of investments from European producers, for example. And again, all of this stems from being able to speak with your own voice, which for English-speaking Canada, so often drowned out by the American voice, has been a real challenge. Now, in the French Canada, you probably have seen some films by French Canadian directors. Their evolution is a little different because of language. In the 1940s, for example, French Canadians began to make films about French Canada in Quebec. And the church at the time, which was very influential in the society, would encourage people, the parishioners, to go support these films because they're made here by us. So the cultural practice of going to the cinema and seeing yourself, and more importantly for the Francophone population, to hear your language, to not be dissolved into the English North American sea. There was a very cultural priority to go to support this kind of activity because the great anxiety for French Canada has always been disappearing, to be swallowed up, assimilated by English Canada. So in Quebec, they developed a very, very strong star system. It's a small universe, but there's stars in it, and people know who the actors are in Quebec. They're all very popular pop culture figures. That's very lacking in English Canada. It's a really interesting difference. But as I say, for Quebecers, it was a cultural priority to go to see films made in Quebec. And there's a word they use, is survivance. It's to survive. So that, it's an act of resistance to keep going to your own movies and not being assimilated by America or English Canada even. So there's a really marked difference in the evolution of movie making in French Canada and in English Canada. This is a very general overview, but it's essentially true. And Quebec also has its own quota system within its borders, and has taken charge of its cinemas in a political sense, unlike English Canada, which we still haven't done. But I guess this is kind of old news given that we're now in the internet age, that you can see films on your phone if you want to. You don't have to trudge into a movie house somewhere. But that is a very curious part of the Canadian film story. And I think what's also interesting about Canadian cinema, maybe this is chicken and egg, but the kinds of stories that you will see in a Canadian film are much different than Hollywood's. In fact, one might even say it might even be a conscious reaction to the Hollywood myths of the triumphant individual protagonist. Our cinema is filled with broken, hopeless losers, at least at a particular era of Canadian cinema history. The stories are generally about people who cannot overcome society's challenges or personal ones. So the dream that we have in our fictions is much different looking than the dream you get in Hollywood. And our heroes are, as I say, are not, one even wonders if you can call them heroes. So I want to show you a couple of clips from a number of films across the history of Canadian cinema. One of the things that Canadians are good at, and I suppose it's out of necessity when you're living beside the United States of America, is that's adjusting to somebody else. Canada was founded as a colony of Great Britain, and was founded as a counter-revolutionary country, unlike the United States, which is a revolutionary, self-created country that rejected Europe. Canada was founded by loyalty to Europe. So we're very comfortable in the colonial position where the power really resides somewhere else. So over the course of our history, we've exchanged London as our kind of our mother for Washington, D.C. That's where the power is as far as we're concerned. So what I mean by that is that we tend to adjust to power or adjust to situations rather than dream that we can overcome them and master the situation. So this is a clip from a film called Last Night. Has anybody seen Last Night? Probably not. From 1998, and this is the ultimate adjusting. This is a story that is basically set on the last night on Earth before the Earth is to be obliterated. So this is set in Toronto, and it's a series of characters who, unlike Independence Day and all those other fantasies of Hollywood blowing stuff out of the stars to prevent it from destroying the Earth, our filmmaker makes a film about people who are getting ready, who have accepted they can do nothing about the end of the world. And that's how you just adjust to the forces that are bigger than you are. And this is a common theme in Canadian cinema. So let's have a look at this little clip here. So the Canadians are not trying to stop the end of the world. They're just partying and waiting for it to come because there's nothing we can do. And this ties into the Canadian cinema's idea of heroism, how our cinematic heroes appear. Again, unlike the Hollywood hero who masters the situation, many of our films deal with characters who are unable to deal with the situation. I want to show you a clip it's from the DVD now, a film made in 1970 called Going Down the Road. Going Down the Road is a story of two young men who live in the eastern part of Canada, a very poor area. They decide they're going to go to the big city, to Toronto, because, you know, as we know, the big cities are where all the action is. But they have this dream of the good life. You know, that life is somewhere else. It's not where you are. It's, you know, down the road somewhere. So they get in their car and they drive to Toronto thinking they're going to, you know, reach the land of milk and honey. And it, as in most Canadian films, it goes badly for them. They arrive in Toronto and things don't work out. So these two characters, Pete and Joey, are kind of mythical figures in Canadian cinema. But they're mythical because they fail. And all of the films of the 70s in particular are filled with characters who it's actually been described by one of our critics as the loser cycle of films in Canadian cinema. So this narrative again of the world is bigger than you are and more powerful. And this story is told again and again in Canadian cinema. So that must have something to do with us. And maybe, perhaps it's, again, as I mentioned, a kind of counter myth to the Hollywood myth of individual agency and power. In the Canadian cinema, you don't have any of that. And the narratives often end badly or open-ended, in the case of Pete and Joey. And this is near the end of the film where they've tried to rob a grocery store because they've run out of money. Well, just let it run. Okay, go ahead. Canadians are so nice. Beat somebody up and then call somebody later. And we're serious about groceries in Canada too, as you can see. So this is a kind of the quintessential Canadian film narrative arc of the 1970s, the loser cycle. These guys then get in that car and then they keep driving west because Toronto hasn't worked out. Just get on the highway and keep going because life is elsewhere. So again, the protagonists of the films that you're making are shaped in this way. I think is a telling thing about the Canadian imagination in the 1970s in particular. So as we move into the 80s, I mean, one of the thematic preoccupations in Canadian cinema is technology and identity. Particularly in the 1980s, it begins with a film called Videodrome. Has anybody seen Videodrome? By David Cronenberg. A film that ponders, and you're all too young to know this, but these things, the smaller versions of them, began to arrive in homes in the 1980s, mid-80s. The handy cam and all of these camcorder devices. So the kind of domestication of technology, people having moving image technologies in their houses and in their hands and in their lives, became a subject of fascination for certainly David Cronenberg, but also Atom Egoyan, whose films are full of characters who are mediating their lives with technology. So I just want to show you a couple of clips. This is from Videodrome, a film about a TV programmer who discovers a program called Videodrome coming from some place in the United States, because, you know, they do beam in signals to us all the time. Cronenberg imagines it in his science fiction kind of way as being something that affects our bodies. The technological signal from the United States, it will deform our bodies in addition to our minds. So again, this idea of the border is always present in the Canadian cinema. So this is a film from 1983, Videodrome. This is a film made under that tax shelter era scheme that I told you about, with American actors making stories in Canada. But this is one of the great films of that particular era, and I think one of the last. So this is a sequence within which the main character begins to interact with technology, and I'll leave it at that. You'll see what happens. It's very lonely in Canada, and cold. So this film, I highly recommend it. It is a very key film in the Canadian cinema in this era, but also in terms of this relationship that we have as Canadians to technologies. Some have argued that Canada itself, this enormous empty land, was in a sense created by technology. In the 19th century it was the railroad, and then came radio, and then came fiber optics and communications technologies. And our vast landscape with only 36 million people in it is kept together in a strange way by technology. So this theme has entered into the Canadian cinema, I think probably most thoroughly in the work of Atom Nguyen. I think we're next of kin is the, or do you have that? That's on DVD. You do? Okay. I'll talk a little bit about it. Atom Nguyen, of course, Armenian-Canadian, who began making his films, very much influenced by Videodrome. Many filmmakers of his generation kind of refer to themselves as the children of Videodrome. That Cronenberg and that whole idea that technologies are biological at some level. And it's amazing, he made this film in 1983, when you think about how technology has evolved since then. Cronenberg has always been a very interesting thinker about the relationship between the technological and the physical body. Agoyan takes up this idea even and extends it even further, and begins to make his early work about how technology changes families, how it redefines relationships between individuals, and how it redefines our notions of the social, and how it can be at once alienating, but also it can help us to find intimacy. So the kind of ambiguity of technology is certainly a main theme in the Canadian cinema, certainly since the mid-1980s. So we've moved out of a kind of dark, fatalist loser cycle into films that actually begin to ponder possibilities. And I think Agoyan is important as well, that his work isn't as downbeat and fatalist as the predecessors. So yeah, if you could just go to chapter 2. I'll just set this up for you. Next of Kin is Atom Nguyen's first feature film from 1984. He made it for like $25,000. It's the story of this disaffected white guy living in Vancouver. He's 6'5". He's totally couldn't be waspier looking. There he is there. Yeah, you just leave it there actually, we can start there. That's him here, Peter. He's going to video family therapy with his family, and they say, well, they tape the sessions and then the people are supposed to go and watch the tapes. So everything's mediated in this, even in Agoyan's first film. People are dealing with their own problems through technology. So here he's on his way to watch the tape of his family's dysfunctional session, and he ends up switching a tape. He finds a tape from an Armenian family that has just moved to Canada, or has recently moved to Canada, and he begins to watch their tape. Well, I'll let it run. It's a strange and funny little film, but it's also about how technology affects individual life. That character's name is Peter, and he's pretending to be a doctor. He's flirting with the secretary there. But Peter watches the tape of the Armenian family, and he discovers that the daughter you see there, who's disaffected from her parents because she's growing up Canadian and they want her to be more traditional, he learns in the tape that they left a son behind on their way to Canada, a son named Bedros. So Peter, the tall white guy, decides he's going to pretend to be Bedros. So he contacts the Armenian family and goes into their life as Bedros, because he's going to make everything better. between Asa, the daughter, and her parents. So there's this very funny and ambiguous drama. Because Peter and his parents don't get along too. So, in other words, the film presents a situation that is totally strange in one level, but also that there's a possibility of reinventing one's identity. And that possibility emerges out of a technological experience. So then Agoyan in his films in the 80s and 90s begins to explore that idea further. And not in this kind of fatalist, dark, loser motif, but rather in a more affirmative set of narratives that emerge in Canadian cinema in the 90s and into the 2000s. So I think to conclude, one of the things that the Canadian cinema's evolution has enabled it to do, and this applies to feature films specifically to what we're talking about today, is to be experimental, to not be conventional in terms of storytelling because the budgets are generally small. And the motivation for making the films is not, generally speaking, commercial. So what does that mean? Well, we have filmmakers who are able to tell stories in experimental or different kinds of styles. So this is a film from 1993 called 32 Short Films About Glenn Gould. And it is a feature film about the famous Canadian musician, pianist Glenn Gould. But it is actually a feature composed of 32 short films. It's actually what the title is. So a very experimental kind of cubist portrait of Glenn Gould. He was played by an actor. It's very much a biopic, but in a totally experimental kind of mode. So I just want to show a couple of sequences from 32 short films about Glenn Gould. Okay, that's a very verbose scene. It's Glenn Gould interviewing himself, so it's the same character talking to himself. And just as an aside, Glenn Gould very famously embraced technology, almost in a Cronenbergian, Egoyan-esque way, where he decided at the age of 32 to stop performing live concerts and only went into the studio from there on for the rest of his career. So the technology of recording became for him, as he was discussing in this little clip, the preferred method of communicating to the world. So you're mediating your communication with technology. So a very Canadian kind of sensibility in that sense. So the Canadian cinema has evolved, as I said, in a kind of strange shadow in its own country, generally. But one of the results of that I've mentioned already that the forms of storytelling are much more experimental and perhaps less commercial, but also that the Canadian cinema has become, in the last, certainly in this century, since 2000, 2002, very international in its orientation, with a lot of co-productions being undertaken with European and other countries. And the Canadian protagonists increasingly are located in a global environment rather than, strictly speaking, a Canadian one. That's another, I think, interesting aspect of our cinema now. But all the stories about identity and technology and all the things I've talked about are still in there. But there seems to be much more of a positive, confident narrative structure that emerges after the 1970s into the 1980s. Where going down the road would not be a film that you would see in Canada these days. But that's a bit of a generalization, but it's true that our country perhaps is a bit more confident about itself, and our filmmakers now have established themselves through television and the internet and other delivery systems to have an audience they didn't have and still don't have in our cinemas, which is, as I mentioned, 97% American. So one of the internationalists, or the benefits or the evidence of internationalism can be found in the films of Xavier Dolan, who's a very young, talented filmmaker from Montreal. And also, not only is he making films with international co-production money, but he's also experimental. And I mentioned that this is kind of a hallmark of the Canadian cinema, that the formal experimentation takes place within our narrative fiction films. So this is a scene from Mummy, a film he made in 2014, which plays with the aspect ratio, the actual size of the image. It's shot as if it's shot on a phone. So it's a very claustrophobic aspect ratio. for most of the film. But there's a couple of sequences where something happens, and I think we'll end on this, and I can take some questions afterwards. But this is, of course, Oasis song, the Oasis song Wonderwall, that I know he spent a lot of money to use. But here's, just watch what happens in this short sequence. So there, this is, has anybody seen Mommy before? Yeah. It's an amazing scene when he pulls the aspect ratio apart. Because in that scene, that character, very troubled young man, is up to that point, you've been in that little box for the whole film. And then at that moment, he breaks the fourth wall, as it were, and pulls apart the aspect ratio. And then it narrows back in later. So there's even within a relatively conventional film, there is this kind of formal experimentation that goes on in that film and in many others as well. And you know, that kind of pushing out the frame lines, I suppose, is a nice metaphor for any film artist trying to do something with this little rectangle that we look at the world through. So, thank you for listening. And take questions, or I'll sit down and have some water.
Հարցեր, կանադական կինոյի մասին հարցեր կա, խնդրեմ։
Ես կուզեի հարցնել ինչ եք կարծում Գայ Մեծինի մասին այդպես։
What I think about Guy Madden?
Yes.
Yes, I forgot to mention Guy. In fact, we have a Guy Madden thing we're going to end with. So, Guy Madden is probably the most radical example of experimentation in contemporary cinema generally, but in Canada in particular. And he emerged in around the same time, the mid-1980s in Winnipeg, as somebody who just loved cinema and decided he would make his films look like they were made in 1925 and work in this silent style. And the most unlikely kind of career emerges out of that experimentation, where he became, with his first feature, his second feature, again, shot in that style. Very, very attractive to festivals, very, very attractive to art cinema people and distributors and investors. And so Guy Madden has now had this extraordinary career making feature films, really within his own art style. Again, very experimental, very DIY, hands-on approach to filmmaking and very auteurist. And he's emerged in the international scene as one of the most original voices in contemporary cinema. So I'm glad you brought him up. And we're going to see a little short he made before we send you on your way into the sun. Thank you for your question.
Ուրիշ հարց։ No questions?
I've explained everything to you.
Մեկ էլ Լոզոնի մասին Լեոնիդի ռեժիսորի, որից օրինակ երկու ֆիլմ հասցրեց նա նկարահանել, շնչուց մահացավ, ու ես ավելի շատ եմ հավանում օրինակ առաջին ֆիլմը, որը համարյա սիրողական կարող է նույնիսկ թվալ, շատ պատվորակի ասել մինչև հիմա, իմ տեսած կողմյան շատ պատվորակի էր, բայց կարող ես հասկանչը ինչ է կարծում ռեժիսորի մասին, ընդհանրապես կվեբեկյան կինոյի մասին ավելի շատ Դենի Արկանից, թեկուզ իր սկզբնական դոկումենտալ ֆիլմերից երկարանը քիչ, բայց և հետո ավելի ուշ ժամանակաշրջան ավելի հայտնի ֆիլմերի մասին։ Merci.
Yeah, Quebec is an extraordinary place for filmmaking. Jean-Claude Lauzon, made two films, Usu la Nuit and Leolo, died in a plane crash. He was also a pilot, but he was an extraordinarily dynamic young writer-director. So his loss is significant. I think, as I mentioned earlier about Quebec's evolution in filmmaking in that part of Canada, a political priority and a cultural priority is to have French saved from being assimilated by English. And this is the history of Canada is very much about that as well, and the tensions that arise. But they really do pay attention to their cultural expression, and they preserve it and they promote it. So the evolution of filmmaking in Quebec is so much more developed and the audiences that go to see it than in English-speaking Canada. And Denis Arcand is extraordinary, who began his career at the National Film Board of Canada making documentary cinema, and then went out into the private sector and began making those very famous films like Jesus of Montreal, and the decline of the American Empire, the barbarian invasions. And he's only, and there's a whole other generation of Denis Villeneuve. You probably know Denis Villeneuve's name. Philippe Falardeau is another one. So there's an incredible reserve of talent in Quebec, and they are nurtured by in French Canada to develop. So there's it's a much more continuous program of support that they get in Quebec. Largely, again, because of this idea of survival. It's a cultural priority because it is such a huge anxiety. Disappearing, that is an anxiety as a culture that we all understand. But in Quebec, it's translated into very powerful cultural expressions in cinema in particular.
Maybe we should see more clips.
Yeah, I just wanted to, and I'm glad you mentioned Guy Madden, because as a kind of treat, I wanted to show this little 5-minute film called The Heart of the World, which Guy Madden, it was a commissioned film he made for the Toronto International Film Festival on its 25th anniversary, where they gave a bunch of Canadian filmmakers some money to make a tribute to the festival, and Guy decided, well, I'm just going to make a short film instead that celebrates cinema. So you'll see, if you don't know who Guy Madden is, you'll have a very good taste of his work. He looks like he's been working alongside Sergei Eisenstein. Both in terms of the compositions of his images, but also the editing is extraordinary. So again, an experimental approach to storytelling that is, I suppose, at some level, characteristic of Canada. Yeah, one more.
Նաև այս ֆիլմը ինչ-որ չափով Փելեշյանի ֆիլմի նման է, որտեղ իմուն երաժշտությունն է այստեղ
Yes.
Սկիրիդովի
That's right. Yes, exactly. Has anybody seen it?
And that will be our last clip, and then we will close the...
Yes, exactly.
So դրա համար ես ուզում եմ մի անգամ շնորհակալությունների մասին մատնեմ, որովհետև մենք հենց որ վերջանակ պատմենք. I would like to thank you and HBO for providing the space and the festival for doing all of that for us, because after the clip we will say goodbye.
Thank you, everybody, for coming too. So enjoy this little movie.